Harold Whitmore, an 84-year-old Korean War veteran, arrives at the State Veterans Museum to honor his fallen friend, Jimmy Callahan. Denied entry for lacking an invitation, he faces dismissal and public disdain. Yet, his quiet dignity catches journalist Melissa Chen's eye. Her viral post exposing the injustice draws attention, revealing Harold's heroic past, including a silver star for bravery. As rain falls, hope seems lost, until General Nathaniel Grayson arrives, saluting Harold and escorting him inside. What secrets of Harold's courage will unfold? Will he finally connect with Jimmy's legacy? Stay tuned for a heart-stirring revelation. Subscribe to celebrate courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Share their stories, keep their legacies alive, and inspire others. Type "Remember" to show gratitude for veterans' enduring impact. Your support ensures no hero is forgotten. Thank you. The sun hung low in the sky as Harold Harry Whitmore stepped off the creaking bus, his worn service yee tilted slightly on his head. At 84, the trip from his quiet, small-town home to the State Veterans Museum had carved a deeper ache into his bones than he'd ever admit. The journey stretched 2 hours each way, a pilgrimage that began in the pre-dawn chill. His arthritic fingers had fumbled through the morning's rituals, pressing his only dress shirt with care, polishing the single military medal he still kept, its edges smoothed by time, and packing a humble sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Since his wife, Martha, passed 5 years ago, Harry's world had shrunk to the modest house they'd bought together after he returned from Korea. His pension stretched just far enough to cover the basics, leaving little room for luxuries. His 2 children, scattered across the country with lives and families of their own, called when they could, but the conversations often felt like echoes across a widening distance. Most of the men who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, brothers in arms from battles long faded into history, were gone now, their voices silenced, leaving Harry to carry their memories alone. Few knew the weight of what Harry had seen. While he'd lied about his age to join the fight in the Pacific, a boy thrust into the brutal final campaigns of World War II. 5 years later, he found himself in the frozen, blood-soaked hills of Korea with the 1st Infantry Division, where the air was thick with gunfire and the screams of the wounded. He'd saved lives in those chaotic moments, his quiet courage steadying men on the brink of despair. But Harry never spoke of his deeds, not out of modesty, but because he believed they were simply what any man would have done in his place. To him, heroism wasn't a badge to wear. It was a duty, fulfilled and left behind. Yet the memories clung to him, vivid and unrelenting. Each Veterans Day, he made his way to memorials, not for recognition, but to honor those who never came home, especially Jimmy Callahan. Jimmy, his closest friend, had died in Harry's arms near the 38th parallel, his blood soaking into the frozen earth as Harry whispered promises he couldn't keep. The weight of that loss pressed against Harry's chest even now, decades later, as sharp as the day it happened. This year, word of a special ceremony at the State Veterans Museum, honoring Korean War veterans, stirred something deep within him. Despite the toll the journey would take on his frail body, Harry knew he had to be there. The museum's towering glass and steel facade gleamed under the morning sun, its entrance draped with flags and banners proclaiming the day's event. Harry adjusted his cap, straightened his spine as much as his curved back allowed, and approached the entrance with a quiet resolve. His heart beat with a mix of anticipation and trepidation, the kind of feeling that reminded him of stepping onto a battlefield long ago. Inside, he knew there would be photographs of young men like Jimmy, frozen in time, and a memorial wall bearing names he'd carried in his heart for decades. At the entrance, a young security guard in a crisp uniform stood with a clipboard, his eyes scanning the crowd with mechanical efficiency. "Invitation, sir?" he asked, barely glancing up from his list. Harry's voice, soft but steady, carried the weight of years. "I don't have one," he said. "I'm a Korean War veteran, served with the 1st Infantry Division." The guard's brow furrowed, his finger tracing the names on his clipboard. "This is an invitation-only event, sir. I can't let you in without proper credentials." Harry's hand, trembling slightly, reached into his pocket and produced a weathered military ID card, its edges frayed from years of being carried, and his Veterans Association membership. "I came a long way," he said, his voice low but earnest. "I just want to pay my respects." The guard's eyes flicked over the documents, his expression hardening. I'm sorry, but those are not valid for today's ceremony. Current invitations only, museum policy. Through the glass doors, Harry could see the preparations unfolding. Black and white photographs of soldiers, some with faces he might have known, lined the walls. A memorial display gleamed under soft lights, and somewhere among the names etched in stone would be Jimmy's. Harry's chest tightened at the thought. Please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My friend's photo is in there. Today's the anniversary of when he fell. The guard's face remained impassive, his tone clipped. No invitation, no entry. You'll have to leave, or I'll call for assistance. Behind Harry, a line of well-dressed attendees began to form, their embossed invitations clutched in manicured hands. Their suits were pressed, their watches gleamed, and their impatience simmered. A man in a tailored coat muttered just loud enough for Harry to hear, "These old-timers always think the rules don't apply to them." A woman nearby glanced at her watch with exaggerated irritation. Some people have no consideration for schedules, she said, her voice sharp. Two more security guards approached, their steps measured but firm. One placed a hand on Harry's elbow, gentle yet unyielding. Sir, you need to step aside. You're holding up the line. Harry's gaze lingered on the memorial display beyond the glass, the names of the fallen calling to him across the years. Then he looked down at his polished shoes, the shine a small act of pride in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. Without a word, he nodded, clutching his service cap in hands that had once held rifles and comrades alike. He stepped back, his dignity a quiet shield against the sting of rejection. As the invited guests swept past him, their voices a low hum of self-importance, Harry stood alone on the sidewalk. He didn't argue or plead. Some battles he knew weren't worth fighting, yet the weight of being turned away, of being unseen, pressed against him, heavier than the years themselves. In that moment, Harry's mind drifted to Jimmy, to the promises made in the chaos of war, to the laughter they'd shared in rare moments of peace. He thought of Martha, her gentle smile urging him to keep going, even when the world felt cold. He stood there, a quiet figure in a faded cap, his heart carrying a history no one in the crowd could fathom. The museum's doors swung shut, the ceremony beginning without him, and still Harry stood, his silence louder than any protest. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we fail to see, their courage etched not in stone but in the lives they saved and the memories they carry. In the gray light of a drizzling morning, Melissa Chen stood outside the State Veterans Museum, her journalist's instincts sharpened by years of chasing stories in war zones. A freelance military correspondent who'd embedded with troops in Afghanistan, she had a keen eye for the details that others overlooked. Details that spoke of sacrifice, resilience, and unspoken pain. As she waited to cover the Korean War memorial ceremony, her gaze settled on an elderly man standing apart from the crowd. There was something about him, a quiet dignity in his posture, that pulled her attention like a magnet. Despite his age, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. Shoulders squared, spine straight, as if time hadn't fully eroded the discipline etched into his bones. His service cap, perched precisely on his head, bore the unmistakable, big red one patch of the 1st Infantry Division, a symbol of America's oldest continuously serving division. But it was the small ribbon pinned to his shirt pocket that stopped her cold. A faded emblem with the words, "Enlock, 1972, never forgotten." Enlock. The name stirred memories of her research into the Vietnam War, a brutal, desperate battle that lingered in the shadows of history, overshadowed by more publicized conflicts. That ribbon wasn't just a decoration, it was a quiet testament to a wound that hadn't healed. Melissa's heart quickened with curiosity and a pang of empathy. She saw in Harold's weathered face a story untold, a life shaped by moments most people could never imagine. She raised her phone, snapping several photos as he turned slowly from the museum entrance, his steps measured but heavy, as if carrying the weight of decades. The contrast struck her deeply. Here was an elderly veteran, excluded from a ceremony meant to honor men like him, standing alone while impeccably dressed socialites and politicians swept past, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The injustice of it gnawed at her. She approached him, her voice gentle but firm. "Excuse me, sir. May I ask your name?" Harold Whitmore looked up, his eyes catching hers with a flicker of surprise. The lines on his face told of years exposed to sun and sorrow, but his gaze was steady, kind. "Harold Whitmore, miss," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Most folks call me Harry." There was a warmth in his tone, but also a guardedness, as if he wasn't used to being noticed anymore. Melissa's eyes flicked to his cap, the big red one patch standing out against the faded fabric. "Mr. Whitmore, I noticed your 1st Infantry Division cap. Did you serve in Vietnam as well as Korea?" A shadow of astonishment crossed Harold's face, followed by a faint, wistful smile. Few people these days recognized military insignia, let alone understood what they meant. "Korea mostly," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Trained some boys who went to Vietnam later. Lost a few of them at An Loc." His words were clipped, but they carried a weight that Melissa felt in her chest. She wanted to ask more, to unravel the stories behind his guarded eyes. But before she could, 2 security guards approached, their expressions stern. "Sir, you need to clear the entrance area if you don't have an invitation," one said, his tone brusque, devoid of warmth. Melissa's protective instincts flared. "He's not bothering anyone," she protested, holding up her press credentials like a shield. "I'm interviewing him for my coverage." Her voice was sharp, but the guard was unmoved. "Interview him somewhere else," he replied curtly. "Museum property is for ticketed guests and event attendees only." Harold didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face unreadable, and allowed himself to be escorted toward the public sidewalk. Melissa followed, her frustration simmering. As they moved, a group of young professionals passed by, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch their words. "Probably just looking for attention," one said with a dismissive smirk. "These old guys are always trying to get special treatment," another added, muttering. "My grandfather's the same way, always bringing up back-in-my-day stories nobody wants to hear." The comments hit Melissa like a slap, but it was Harold's reaction that cut deeper. His shoulders, already bowed by age, seemed to slump further, as if the words had added another layer to the invisible burden he carried. His face remained stoic, but Melissa caught the faint tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes briefly dropped to the ground. He said nothing, simply sat heavily on a bench facing the museum entrance, the drizzle beginning to dampen his coat. The sight of him there, alone in the growing rain, watching as important guests continued to arrive, stirred a quiet anger in Melissa. This was a man who had seen combat, who had likely stared death in the face, and now he was reduced to an outsider at an event meant to honor his sacrifice. Driven by a mix of indignation and compassion, Melissa pulled out her phone and posted one of Harold's photos to Twitter. Her caption was simple but pointed. "A forgotten hero denied entry to the Korean War Memorial Ceremony at State Veterans Museum. His crime? No invitation. Zero respect for our veterans." She hit send, her heart pounding with the hope that someone, anyone, would care. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction, rippling through military communities and veterans groups. Comments flooded in, each one a mix of outrage and heartbreak. "Disgraceful treatment of one of our own. This is how we honor sacrifice? Shameful. Someone identify this soldier. He deserves better." One comment from a retired colonel stopped her scrolling. "That's Harold Whitmore, Silver Star recipient, first ID. Someone contact General Grayson immediately." A Silver Star, Melissa's breath caught. This wasn't just a veteran. This was a decorated hero, and he was sitting alone in the rain, dismissed by those who should have been rolling out the red carpet. Inside the museum, the ceremony preparations continued, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding outside. Dr. Eleanor Harmon, the university president and event organizer, sat in her office, surrounded by the buzz of assistants and the clink of champagne glasses. An urgent email from a veterans advocacy group landed in her inbox, detailing the situation with Harold. She scanned it quickly, her lips pursing in mild annoyance. To her, it was a minor hiccup, a misunderstanding that could wait. She had dignitaries to greet, speeches to oversee. "Send a form response," she instructed her assistant. Her tone clipped. "Promise we'll look into it after the event." Her focus was on the polished spectacle inside, not the lone figure on the sidewalk, his story reduced to a footnote in her busy day. Outside, the rain intensified, soaking Harold's cap and coat. A young museum employee, his face softened by pity, approached with a paper cup of coffee. "You should probably head home, sir," he said gently. "The ceremony's going to run for hours, and this weather's only getting worse." Harold accepted the coffee with a nod, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then almost to himself he added, "I promised Jimmy I'd be here 52 years ago today. Said I wouldn't forget him. Jimmy, James Callahan, my best friend, died at Heartbreak Ridge. His name's on your wall in there." The words spilled out, heavy with memory, and Melissa, standing nearby, felt her throat tighten. She could almost see the young Harold, standing beside his friend in the chaos of war, making a promise that had anchored him for decades. The employee shifted uncomfortably, his kindness at odds with his powerlessness. "I'm sorry, sir. I wish I could help," he said before retreating back inside. Harold remained on the bench, the coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes fixed on the museum entrance. The rain blurred the world around him, but he didn't move. To him, this wasn't just a ceremony, it was a sacred obligation, a way to honor a friend who never made it home. The weight of that promise and the sting of being turned away pressed against his chest, but he bore it silently, as he had borne so much else. Melissa watched him, her heart heavy with the injustice of it all, her phone buzzing with notifications as her post continued to spread. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. Harold Whitmore's story deserved to be heard, and she would make sure it was. The rain poured down in unrelenting waves, soaking through Harold Whitaker's service cap until it sagged against his scalp. The once crisp fabric, now a sodden, darkened weight. He sat alone on a weathered bench outside the museum, the chill of the wet seeping into his worn joints, each ache a quiet echo of battles fought long ago. From afar, the sounds of the Veterans Day ceremony floated through the air, crisp orders for the presentation of colors, the somber swell of the national anthem. For the first time in decades, Harold wasn't standing tall, his weathered hand pressed to his chest in salute. The absence of that ritual carved a deep hollow in his heart, a betrayal of the man he'd once been, the man who'd carried his duty like a second skin. "Maybe they're right," he whispered to himself, the words lost in the rain's steady rhythm. "Maybe it's all faded into history now. Maybe no one cares anymore." The thought wasn't unfamiliar, but today it landed with a sharper edge, cutting into the pride he'd held onto so fiercely. This place, this museum, was built to honor men like him, men like Jimmy, whose memory clung to Harold's soul like damp earth. He sipped his coffee, now cold and tasteless, and let his mind wander to the faces of brothers in arms, their smiles frozen in time, their voices still clear in the quiet corners of his memory. The world had blurred around him over the years, leaving him feeling like a ghost in a time that no longer needed him. He was bracing for the long bus ride back home, lone when sirens wailed, slicing through the drizzle. Harold glanced up, squinting through the gray haze to see red and blue lights flashing in the distance. A convoy of police motorcycles roared into sight, followed by a line of black SUVs, their government plates gleaming despite the gloom. Tiny flags fluttered from the lead vehicles, hinting at the presence of someone significant. Likely a military officer, Harold guessed. He turned back to his coffee, uninterested. These officials, with their starched speeches and practiced gestures, were part of a world no longer his, to him. He had no use for their ceremony today. Inside the museum, Melissa Chen steadied her camera, filming the ceremony with the sharp focus of a journalist who'd honed her craft through countless stories. The crowd was respectful, the speakers heartfelt, but her mind was only half present. Her phone vibrated, drawing her attention. She slipped it out and read a cryptic message. From a military contact, "Stay near the entrance by. Something's about to happen. If you believe gratitude for those who sacrificed is never enough, type Cullen honor." Her heart skipped. She typed the code word swiftly, her instincts flaring. Whatever was unfolding, it was no ordinary moment. Outside, Harold shifted on the bench, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. The rain's steady cadence on his cap echoed the dull pulse in his chest. Maybe it was time to surrender, to the years, to the indifference. Jimmy's memory would have to live in the silence of his heart this year, far from the ceremony he'd been excluded from attending. He steadied himself, preparing for the journey home. To stand, his thoughts already on the bus timetable. Nothing left for me here, he thought, the words heavy with finality. But before he could rise, the SUVs halted abruptly in front of the museum's entrance. Doors swung open and security personnel emerged with practiced precision, fanning out to secure the area. Their movements were fluid, their gazes alert. From the central SUV stepped a figure in an immaculate military dress uniform, his decorations catching the faint light. 4 silver stars shone on his shoulders, a mark of immense authority. General Nathaniel Grayson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood tall, his presence commanding the scene. His piercing eyes scanned the surroundings, then locked on Harold, alone in the rain. Harold didn't notice at first, adrift in his memories, but as Grayson's boots clicked closer, bypassing the museum entrance, Harold's old instincts stirred. He pushed himself upright, his body groaning, and tried to square his shoulders, the reflex of a soldier still alive beneath the years. Grayson stopped before him and offered a flawless salute, crisp and unwavering. "Staff Sergeant Harold Whitaker, 1st Infantry Whitmore Division," Grayson said, his voice resonant, cutting through the rain. Harold's hand shook as he returned the salute, his chest tightening with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Yes, sir," he rasped, his voice roughened by time, "though it's been a long time since anyone called me by that rank." "Not long enough, it seems," Grayson's replied, a trace of warmth softening his tone. His words drew eyes. Security personnel, nearby guests, all pausing to witness the moment. "I understand there's been a mix-up with your invitation today." Harold's parted to speak, but Grayson's pressed on, his voice steady. "Staff Sergeant Harold Whitmore, the President extends his personal apologies for any inconvenience caused. Your service record reached our desk just hours ago." An aide stepped forward, raising an umbrella over both men, shielding them from the downpour. "Sir," the aide said to Harold, his tone reverent, "we've confirmed your identity. Your Silver Star citation from Heartbreak Ridge is still taught at West Point, a testament to unparalleled bravery under fire." Harold's gaze fell, his throat tight. "I just did what was needed, sir," he murmured, "like all the boys." Grayson shook his head, his expression unyielding. "Carrying 3 wounded men to safety through enemy fire, then holding your ground alone until reinforcements came, that's far beyond duty, Sergeant." A crowd had gathered by you now, their whispers fading into the rain's rhythm. The security guards who'd dismissed Harold earlier stood frozen, their faces tight with unease. From the museum's doors, Dr. Elias Harmon, the university president behind the ceremony, rushed out, her steps hurried. "General Grayson's," she called, her voice bright but strained. "We're deeply honored by your presence. The ceremony is underway, and we've reserved—" Grayson's raised a hand, silencing her. "Dr. Harmon," he said, his tone unyielding, "there's been a grave error in your arrangements. One of our most distinguished Korean War veterans was turned away from this ceremony." Harmon's faltered, her poise cracking. "It must be a misunderstanding," she stammered. "We adhered to the invitation protocols precisely." "The error," Grayson's interjected, his voice ringing with authority, "is assuming men like Staff Sergeant Harold Whitmore need invitations to enter a place built to honor their sacrifice." The weight of memory pressed heavily on Harold Whitmore as he stood outside the museum, his heart a tangle of pride and sorrow. The general, his face etched with the authority of years in command, turned to him with a softened gaze, one that seemed to see not just the elderly man before him, but the young sergeant who had once faced the crucible of war. "Sergeant Whitmore," the general said, his voice warm yet resolute, "would you allow me the privilege of walking with you inside? There's someone waiting, someone I believe you've come here to meet today." Harold's throat tightened, words caught in a swell of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He managed a nod, his eyes glistening with the ghosts of battles long past. The general took Harold's arm, not with the condescension one might offer to a frail old man, but with the steady grip of a comrade, a silent acknowledgement of shared burdens. Together, they moved toward the museum's entrance, their steps deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of history. The crowd parted instinctively, a sea of faces blurring into a quiet reverence. Security guards, moments ago rigid with protocol, suddenly found their polished shoes far more interesting than the scene unfolding before them, their authority eclipsed by something greater. Inside, the museum's grand hall hummed with the ongoing ceremony. A speaker stood at the podium, mid-sentence weaving a narrative about the Korean War's historical significance, a conflict too often relegated to the margins of memory. But as Harold and the general entered, the speaker's voice faltered, the words trailing off like a breeze caught in a sudden stillness. Heads turned, whispers rippling through the audience like wind across a field. The general, undeterred, guided Harold not to some shadowed corner at the back, but straight down the center aisle, toward the front row where the weight of prestige hung heavy among the seated dignitaries. The speaker hesitated, unsure, until the general offered a calm nod. "Please carry on," he said, his tone both commanding and gracious. "We're merely correcting a small oversight in the seating." With that, he led Harold to the very heart of the front row, where polished suits and decorated uniforms shifted to make room. "Gentlemen," the general announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "please accommodate Staff Sergeant Harold Whitmore, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, and Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and the distinguished guests moved swiftly, their earlier composure giving way to a humbler deference. As Harold settled into his seat, the general leaned close, his voice low but clear. "Third seat from the left," he murmured. "That's James Callahan's son. He's been longing to meet someone who knew his father." Harold's breath caught, his gaze snapping to the middle-aged man now staring at him, eyes wide with a dawning recognition. The resemblance was uncanny, Jimmy's determined jawline, the same sharp, alert eyes that had once scanned the horizon for danger. For a moment, Harold was back on that frozen battlefield, Jimmy's laughter echoing in his ears, a fleeting warmth against the bitter cold of war. The general stepped to the podium, relieving the startled speaker with a presence that silenced the room's restless undertones. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of conviction, "I apologize for the interruption, but some matters demand immediate attention. We gather today to honor the sacrifices of those who served in Korea, a war too often forgotten. Yet in our zeal for ceremony, we nearly overlooked one of its most distinguished heroes." He gestured toward Harold, who sat rigid, unaccustomed to such spotlight. "Staff Sergeant Harold Whitmore of the 1st Infantry Division embodies the courage we claim to celebrate. When he arrived today to pay tribute to his fallen brothers, especially his closest friend, James Callahan, whose name is etched on our memorial wall, he was turned away for lack of a printed invitation." A heavy silence fell, the audience shifting uncomfortably, the sting of the general's words cutting through their collective conscience. "I'm not here to cast blame," he continued, his tone softening, but no less resolute. "I'm here to right a wrong. The purpose of this museum, this memorial, is not mere pageantry. It exists to ensure that the sacrifices of men like Sergeant Whitmore and Private Callahan are never erased from our memory." His words hung in the air, a call to something deeper, something enduring. As if stirred by an unspoken signal, the audience rose, their applause swelling into a spontaneous ovation, not born of protocol, but of a shared awakening. Harold remained seated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from obscurity to recognition. His heart pounded, memories of Jimmy, his grin, his courage, his final moments, flooding back with a clarity that stole his breath. He had come to honor his friend, expecting only quiet reflection, not this tidal wave of acknowledgement. A small boy, no older than 8, broke free from his parents' side and approached Harold with a solemnity that seemed far beyond his years. Standing before the old soldier, he raised a small hand in a crisp salute. "Thank you for protecting us, sir," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. Harold's eyes brimmed as he returned the salute, his hand trembling slightly. "Just did my duty, son," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. The boy shook his head, his expression earnest. "My dad's a soldier too. He says doing your duty when it's really hard is what makes a hero." The applause continued, a steady roar that seemed to anchor Harold in the moment. Beside him, James Callahan's son shifted closer, his hand reaching out to grasp Harold's with a quiet intensity. "I've waited my whole life to meet someone who knew my father," he said, his voice thick with years of unanswered questions, of a longing to connect with a man he had only known. Harold met his gaze, seeing Jimmy in every line of the weight of loss mirrored in his own. "I have so many answers," he replied softly, a promise woven into the words. "Your father, Jimmy, he'd be so proud of you. He believed in honor, the kind that never fades." That day was not an ending but a turning point in Harold Whitmore's life. For decades, he had lived in the quiet solitude of survival, his memories of Korea tucked away like a soldier's kit, touched only in moments of private reverence. But the incident at the museum sparked something larger, a nationwide movement called Honor the Forgotten, a campaign to seek out and share the stories of veterans whose sacrifices had slipped into the shadows. General Grayson, deeply moved by Harold's quiet dignity and the injustice he'd faced, became a tireless advocate for the cause. "We don't just owe veterans our thanks," he told reporters, his voice resolute. "We owe them our time, our attention. Their stories aren't artifacts to be archived. They're living history, and we lose pieces of that history every day." For Harold, the changes were both humbling and daunting, a new chapter he had never imagined. The weight of recognition, the voices of strangers now calling his name, stirred a mix of pride and vulnerability. Yet in the quiet moments of memory, it was Jimmy's face that grounded him, a reminder that honor indeed never fades. In a small, unassuming town, Harold Whitmore's modest home became a beacon for those drawn to his remarkable story. Military officials, historians, and most poignantly, fellow veterans made pilgrimages to his doorstep, each seeking a connection to a man whose life embodied quiet resilience. Young service members, fresh from their own battles, sat at his kitchen table, hanging on his every word. They weren't just there for tales of valor, but for the deeper truths he carried, truths forged in the crucible of conflicts from World War II to Korea. Captain Miranda Reches, who had recently returned from Afghanistan, felt an instant kinship with Harold. "He gets it," she said, her voice thick with admiration. "It's not just the slang or the shared jargon of soldiers. It's the unspoken weight of service, the sacrifices that linger in your bones no matter when or where you fought." For Miranda, listening to Harold was like hearing her own heart translated into words. His stories bridged decades, connecting her modern struggles to the timeless burdens of those who came before. The State Veterans Museum, once a quiet repository of artifacts, underwent a transformation inspired by Harold's presence. His weathered service cap, faded by time but heavy with meaning, was enshrined in a new exhibit called The Everyday Hero. It rested proudly beside the Medal of Honor collection, a testament to the quiet courage that doesn't demand a spotlight. Beneath the cap, a simple inscription captured his essence: a quiet giant, a lasting legacy. Those words resonated with visitors, who stood in silent reverence, imagining the man who wore that cap through moments of unimaginable trial. For them, Harold wasn't just a veteran. He was a living monument to the uncelebrated heroes who walk among us. Perhaps the most profound chapter of Harold's story was his friendship with Thomas Callahan, the son of his long-lost comrade, Jimmy. Thomas, a history professor at the State University, had grown up with only fragments of his father, faded photographs and half-remembered stories passed down by relatives. Jimmy had been a ghost, a figure Thomas longed to know but could never fully grasp. That changed when Harold entered his life. Through Harold's vivid recollections, Jimmy came alive in ways Thomas had never dreamed possible. "He gave me my father," Thomas said during a documentary interview, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Not just the facts of his life, but the way his laugh filled a room, the way he'd break his rations in half to share with a friend, the way he spoke about me, his baby boy he'd never meet, with such hope and love. Each story was a gift, a piece of a father Thomas had lost to war, now returned through Harold's unwavering memory. Together, they poured their shared love for Jimmy into the Callahan Whitmore Scholarship, a fund to support veterans pursuing higher education. The first recipient, a young Marine who had lost a leg in combat, spoke of the scholarship with a trembling voice. "It's not just about the money," he said. "It's knowing someone like Harold believes in me. He's been where I am, and he's telling me I can keep going." For the Marine, Harold's belief was a lifeline, a reminder that his sacrifices were seen and valued by someone who understood. Harold's story rippled outward, touching even the youngest hearts. During a school visit organized by the museum's new outreach program, A 10-year-old girl listened intently as Harold shared glimpses of his past. Her small hand shot up, her question cutting through the room's quiet reverence. "Did you have to talk a lot to be a hero?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Harold's weathered face softened, a gentle smile creasing his features. "No, little one," he replied, his voice warm with patience. "The truest heroes I knew didn't say much about what they did. They just showed up, day after day, when the world needed them." The girl tilted her head, undeterred. "Like how you kept showing up at the museum, even when they didn't want you there?" she pressed. Harold paused, his eyes distant as if revisiting those moments of rejection. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "the most important thing we can do is just be there for the people we care about. I made a promise to my friend Jimmy to keep his memory alive. Promises like that, they matter, especially when they're hard to keep." The exchange, captured on a parent's phone, spread like wildfire online, touching millions who saw in Harold's words a humble wisdom that felt both timeless and urgently needed. On the following Veterans Day, Harold's journey took on a new layer of meaning. No longer did he ride a solitary bus to honor the fallen. Instead, a motorcade of volunteer drivers from the Veterans Motorcycle Association escorted him across the state, their engines roaring in tribute. At each memorial, Harold performed a quiet ritual, placing a small stone on the monuments, a gesture rooted in an ancient tradition that whispered, "You are not forgotten." The act was simple, yet it carried the weight of decades of loyalty to those who never came home. When a reporter asked if he felt vindicated by the outpouring of recognition, Harold's response was as steady as ever. "Vindication isn't what I was after," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had seen humanity's highs and lows. "This isn't about me. It's about the ones who didn't make it back. As long as one person remembers what they stood for, they're never truly gone." His words hung in the air, a reminder that his life's work was not about personal glory, but about preserving the legacy of those he loved. Harold's story invites reflection on the countless others like him, quiet carriers of history who move through the world unnoticed. They don't wear their sacrifices like banners or demand applause for their service. Their heroism lies not only in the battles they fought long ago, but in the way they've carried those experiences through life, steadfastly, humbly, without expectation of reward. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, Harold's quiet strength stands as a counterpoint, a reminder that the most profound acts of courage often unfold in silence, a promise kept against all odds, a memory honored despite the passage of time, a commitment to principles that endure through changing eras. How many Harold Whitmores walk among us? The elderly man in the grocery store, his posture still military erect, his eyes carrying stories he rarely shares. The quiet woman who served as a nurse in a war zone, her memories locked away but never forgotten. The neighbor who stands at attention during the national anthem, a silent tribute to comrades lost. Their stories fade into the background, unwitnessed, unless we choose to listen. What sets Harold apart isn't the dramatic intervention by General Grayson, though it brought a satisfying resolution to his journey. It's his unwavering resolve to honor his friend Jimmy, even when the world turned him away. It's the dignity he maintained in the face of rejection, the humility he embodied when recognition finally came. These qualities speak to a character that transcends the need for acclaim, yet deserves it all the more. Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength hinted at depths you could only imagine? Someone whose presence suggested trials overcome, principles upheld, sacrifices made without fanfare. These individuals are the guardians of our shared history. Their influence felt not in grand gestures, but in the steady example they set. When did you last truly listen to an elder's story, not with polite nods, but with the reverence due to someone whose experiences shape the world we inhabit? Every veteran, every elder, carries fragments of our collective past. When we fail to listen, those fragments vanish forever. There are heroes who need no monuments, warriors whose greatest battles were fought long after they laid down their weapons, guardians of memory who ask only that we pause to honor what they protect. The next time you meet a veteran, consider offering more than a fleeting "thank you for your service." Ask a question. Listen to a story. Bear witness to a piece of living history before it slips away. In doing so, you become part of the promise Harold kept, a promise to remember, to honor, and to ensure that no one is truly forgotten.